Hi, I'm Linda, and I'm 28 years old. I thought my sister's wedding would be the day I'd finally feel like I belonged in my family. Instead, it became the moment my father grabbed the microphone and called me something so cruel in front of everyone that I still can't believe it happened. But here's what he didn't know: I had a secret that would change everything. A truth he'd been hiding for 20 years. And when I took that microphone from him, I made sure everyone knew exactly who I really am. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't believe what I revealed about my own father. The accident happened when I was 8 years old. One moment I was climbing our old oak tree in the backyard, the next I was lying in a hospital bed being told I'd never walk again. A fall that lasted seconds changed everything. Not just for me, but for my entire family. Especially my father, Harold. Before the accident, I was Daddy's little girl. He'd swing me around the yard, teach me to throw a baseball, carry me on his shoulders during neighborhood walks. But the moment the doctors said the word paralyzed, something in my father died. Or maybe something in him just gave up on me. Harold stopped using my name. I became the burden. When neighbors asked how I was doing, he'd say things like, "Well, we're managing with our situation." When I started using a wheelchair, he'd park me in corners at family gatherings like I was furniture nobody wanted to acknowledge. My sister Margaret was 2 years younger, but she quickly became the golden child. Athletic, popular, everything I could no longer be. Harold poured all his dreams into her. Soccer games, dance recitals, academic awards. He cheered louder for her than any parent in those bleachers. Meanwhile, I sat at home with our mother Beverly, who loved me but never had the courage to stand up to Harold's coldness. The cruel comments started small. "Maybe you should stay home from this family gathering, Linda. It's just easier." Then they got worse. "I don't know why you bother trying so hard in school. It's not like you can have a normal career anyway." By the time I was 16, he'd openly tell people I was limited in what I could contribute to the family. But here's what Harold never understood about me. Every cruel word, every dismissive look, every time he acted ashamed of me, it just made me more determined to prove him wrong. When he said I couldn't have a normal career, I decided I'd have an extraordinary one. I graduated valedictorian from high school, got a full scholarship to Northwestern University, studied graphic design and digital marketing while Harold told relatives I was playing around with computers. He didn't attend my graduation. Said he had to work that day, but I saw him at the hardware store buying lawn fertilizer. After college, I started freelancing. Small projects at first local businesses, nonprofit organizations. But my work was good. Really good. Within 3 years, I was designing marketing campaigns for major corporations. Nike, Samsung, even Coca-Cola. My client list read like a Fortune 500 directory, but Harold had no idea. To him, I was still just the disappointment who rolled around the house in a wheelchair. The irony was devastating. While Harold spent 20 years telling anyone who'd listen that I was worthless, I was building a six-figure income and a reputation that reached across the country. But I kept it secret. Maybe I was protecting myself from his inevitable dismissal. Maybe I was protecting him from the truth about how wrong he'd been. When Margaret announced her engagement to Thomas, I saw it as a chance. Maybe finally at this family celebration I could belong. Maybe Harold would look at me with something other than shame. I was so naive. The morning of Margaret's wedding, I arrived at the venue early. I'd spent hours the night before decorating my wheelchair with white roses and baby's breath. I wanted to look perfect to fit seamlessly into the celebration. The venue was this beautiful garden pavilion, all white columns and sprawling oak trees. I found Margaret in the bridal suite panicking over seating charts. "Linda, thank God you're here," she said, but I caught the relief in her voice. Relief that someone was there to help, not necessarily that it was me. Harold was directing the setup crew, his voice carrying across the garden. "Move those chairs back. We need more space for accessibility requirements." The way he said it made me sound like a fire hazard. Thomas's family was mingling nearby elegant people in expensive clothes who kept glancing at me with polite curiosity. I wheeled over to introduce myself to Thomas's parents, but Harold intercepted me. "Don't mind Linda," he told them with that familiar apologetic smile. "She's limited in what she can contribute today, but she tries." He patted my shoulder like I was a well-meaning pet. The memory hit me like a physical blow. My high school graduation 8 years earlier. I'd graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship, had my pick of universities. I was giving the valedictorian speech looking out at the packed auditorium for Harold's face, the empty seat in the third row where he should have been sitting. Beverly later told me he'd said he was too embarrassed to watch me struggle up to the podium in my wheelchair. Too embarrassed. Of his daughter who'd just achieved the highest academic honor in her class. Standing there at Margaret's wedding watching Harold apologize for my existence to Thomas's family, that 18-year-old pain felt fresh again. But I pushed it down. Today was about Margaret. I could be invisible for one more day. I spent the morning helping with wedding favors using my graphic design skills to create beautiful place cards with hand-lettered calligraphy. Each one took 10 minutes, but they looked like something from a luxury stationery store. When I finished the last one, Harold glanced over. "Anyone could have done that," he said, not even looking at my work. "But I guess it kept you busy." Beverly watched this exchange with that familiar pained expression she got whenever Harold was particularly cruel. But she said nothing. 20 years of saying nothing while her husband systematically destroyed her daughter's self-worth. Margaret came by as I was finishing the place cards. "These are gorgeous, Linda," she said, and for a moment I felt that warm sister connection we used to have as kids. But then Harold called her away to meet more of Thomas's relatives, and I watched her transform back into his perfect daughter. The morning wore on, with me helping where I could, staying out of the way where I couldn't. Harold moved through the preparations like a proud father, beaming at photographers, shaking hands with guests. Every few minutes his eyes would land on me, and that proud expression would flicker, replaced by something that looked like disappointment. Not sadness for what I'd lost, but disappointment that I existed at all. By noon I'd made a decision. I was tired of being ashamed of taking up space, tired of apologizing for existing. Today somehow that was going to change. I just didn't know how yet. The ceremony was beautiful. Margaret looked radiant in her flowing white dress, Thomas handsome in his navy suit. They'd chosen this outdoor pavilion surrounded by towering oak trees, natural sunlight filtering through the leaves. It should have been magical. I was positioned in the back corner, my wheelchair tucked behind the last row of chairs where I wouldn't obstruct the view. From there, I watched families celebrating together, parents holding hands, siblings laughing and sharing memories, children running between the rows in their dress clothes. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere except me. During the ceremony, I found myself studying other families. The way Thomas's father's eyes filled with tears when Margaret said her vows. How his mother reached over to squeeze his hand during the ring exchange. The easy affection, the pride that radiated from every gesture. I tried to imagine Harold looking at me that way. I couldn't. The reception began immediately after setup on the adjacent lawn under string lights and white tents. I struggled with the accessibility immediately. Harold had chosen this venue despite my needs, not because of them. The bar was too high for me to reach. The buffet tables required standing to access most dishes. Even the restroom was a 10-minute journey across uneven grass that left my arms aching. I watched Harold work the crowd, introducing Margaret to everyone as my brilliant daughter, the architect. His voice carried such pride when he talked about her master's degree, her job at a prestigious firm, her bright future with Thomas. When people asked about his other daughter, I'd see him gesture vaguely in my direction. "That's Linda, Margaret's sister." Not my daughter Linda, not Linda who graduated valedictorian, not Linda who runs her own business, just Margaret's sister. Like my only identity was in relation to someone else. Gerald Patterson, my father's oldest friend, approached my table during cocktail hour. He'd known our family since before I was born, watched me grow up. "How are you doing, Linda?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested he actually wanted an honest answer. "I'm fine, Mr. Patterson," I said automatically. He studied my face for a long moment. "Are you really?" The question caught me off guard. When was the last time anyone in my family had asked how I was actually doing? Some days are harder than others, I admitted. Gerald nodded slowly. "I've watched your father for a lot of years, Linda. Sometimes good people make terrible mistakes and then spend decades doubling down on them instead of admitting they were wrong." He paused, glancing toward Harold, who was holding court near the bar. "Sometimes the people we should be proudest of are the ones we overlook completely." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. Did Gerald know something about my work, my success? We'd never discussed my career, but Harold's landscaping company did work for several businesses in town. It was possible Gerald had seen my name on contracts or marketing materials. Before I could ask what he meant, Harold's voice boomed across the reception. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. As father of the bride, I'd like to say a few words." My stomach clenched. I'd been dreading this moment all day. Harold's speeches were always about Margaret's perfection and his pride in raising such an accomplished daughter, which inevitably included comparisons to his other child, the disappointment. Margaret beamed at Harold as he took the microphone, her face glowing with happiness. Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist, both of them looking at Harold with such love and admiration. This was their moment, their perfect family moment. And I was about to watch Harold use it to remind everyone exactly why I didn't belong. Harold's voice filled the garden as he began his speech. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this beautiful day with our family." He paused, his chest swelling with paternal pride. "I have to say, as Margaret's father today represents everything I hoped for when I first held her as a baby." The crowd smiled and murmured approval. Margaret's eyes were already welling with tears of joy. Harold continued, his voice gaining strength and confidence. "You know, raising children teaches you so much about life, about dreams and disappointments, about what really matters." His eyes swept across the crowd, landing briefly on me before moving on. "I've been blessed with one perfect daughter who has exceeded every expectation I ever had." One perfect daughter. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. This was Margaret's day. I would not ruin it. Margaret graduated summa cum laude from Stanford. She's built an incredible career as an architect. She's kind, accomplished, beautiful. Everything a father could want in a daughter. Harold's voice was thick with emotion now. And today she's marrying Thomas, who loves her as much as we do. The crowd applauded. Margaret wiped away happy tears. Thomas kissed her temple. It was a beautiful moment of family love and celebration. Then Harold's tone shifted. "Of course, it hasn't all been easy. Life tests families in different ways. Having a worthless cripple in the family teaches you what really matters. It makes you appreciate the child who can actually contribute to society." The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, the crowd seemed frozen, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Then came the uncomfortable shuffling. A few nervous laughs from people who didn't know how else to react. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. I felt my body go cold, then hot, then numb. 28 years old, and my father had just called me a worthless cripple in front of 100 people. At my sister's wedding, into a microphone. Margaret's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Thomas looked horrified, his arm tightening protectively around Margaret. Several guests were staring at me now, some with pity, others with shock at Harold's cruelty. Beverly had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But she said nothing. Just like always, Harold, oblivious to the stunned silence he'd created, continued his speech. "So today, as we celebrate Margaret and Thomas, I want everyone to know how grateful I am for my one successful child, the daughter who makes me proud every single day. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broke, but snapped into place, like a bone setting after years of being displaced. I'd spent 20 years making myself smaller to manage Harold's shame. 20 years accepting his narrative that I was less than human. Not anymore. I rolled my wheelchair forward, cutting through the crowd toward the front of the reception. People stepped aside, watching in fascination as I navigated between tables and chairs. Harold was still talking, but his voice was beginning to falter as he noticed the disturbance. Gerald Patterson appeared beside me quietly, helping move chairs out of my path. "That's it, Linda," he murmured. "It's time." When I reached the front, Harold stopped mid-sentence. The microphone was in his hand, and he looked down at me with that familiar expression of annoyed inconvenience, like I was interrupting something important. "Harold," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the sudden silence, "I'd like to say something." He blinked clearly, caught off guard. "Linda, this isn't really the time." "Give me the microphone, Dad." Something in my voice made him comply. His hand was shaking slightly as he passed me the microphone. The crowd waited in perfect silence. Margaret was staring at me with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I looked out at all those faces. Family friends, Margaret's colleagues, Thomas's relatives, people who'd just heard my father call me a worthless cripple, people who'd laughed or stayed silent while he did it. My hands were steady as I raised the microphone to speak. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Margaret and Thomas today." I began, my voice clear and strong. "This is indeed a beautiful celebration of love and family." I paused, looking around the crowd. Some people were still shifting, uncomfortably unsure what was coming next. Harold stood beside me, his face growing pale as he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. My father just shared his perspective on our family. He talked about having one successful child and one, well, you heard what he called me. A few people in the crowd winced. Now I'd like to share mine. Margaret was watching me with wide eyes, her hand clutched in Thomas's. I could see her torn between wanting to support me and fearing what I might say at her wedding. For 20 years, my father has told this story about our family, about his successful daughter Margaret and his disappointing daughter Linda, about the burden of having a disabled child, about how much easier life would be if I could just contribute something meaningful to society. I smiled at the crowd, and several people smiled back uncertainly. What my father doesn't know is that for the past 5 years, I've been running my own graphic design company. I create marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies: Nike, Samsung, Coca-Cola, Microsoft. Last year alone, my company generated over $400,000 in revenue. The crowd's attention sharpened. Harold's face went from pale to gray. Margaret's mouth dropped open. "But that's not the secret I want to share with you today." I continued, enjoying the growing tension on Harold's face. "The secret is about my father's landscaping business, Harold Patterson Landscaping. The company he's so proud of, the one that supported our family for 30 years. Harold's breathing was becoming shallow. He knew what was coming. 2 years ago, Dad's business was failing. The recession hit his commercial clients hard. He was 3 months behind on his business loan payments. The bank was threatening foreclosure. He had no idea how he was going to save the company that's been his life's work. I looked directly at Harold now. His face had gone completely white. That's when I started Patterson Corporate Landscapes, my own landscaping company specifically designed to subcontract work to smaller established firms. Over the past 2 years, Patterson Corporate has hired Harold Patterson Landscaping for over $600,000 worth of projects. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gerald Patterson was nodding, tears in his eyes. Margaret looked like she might faint. The Riverside Mall renovation project that Dad's so proud of winning, that was my contract. The new subdivision landscaping that he thought he landed through his reputation, mine. The corporate campus designs that he brags about to his friends, all mine. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I have the emails right here, the contracts, the bank transfers. For 2 years, the daughter my father calls a worthless cripple has been the anonymous benefactor keeping his business afloat. Harold tried to speak, but no words came out. The crowd was completely silent processing this revelation. The father who spent 20 years telling people I can't contribute to society has been living off my contributions for 24 months. The man who's ashamed to call me his daughter has been depositing my money into his business account twice a month. I looked back at the crowd, my voice growing stronger. My father was right about one thing. Life does teach you what really matters. It taught me that my worth isn't determined by his opinion of me. It taught me that success isn't measured by whether someone can walk or roll. And it taught me that sometimes the people who should love you unconditionally are the ones who need to learn what unconditional really means. Margaret was crying now, but these weren't tears of joy anymore. Thomas had his arm around her, his face a mixture of shock and admiration as he looked at me. So yes, Dad, you're right. Today is about appreciating what really matters. And what really matters is that the daughter you've spent 20 years calling worthless has spent the last 2 years keeping your dreams alive. I handed the microphone back to Harold, whose hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Now, I said, smiling at Margaret, let's get back to celebrating this beautiful wedding. The silence that followed was deafening. 100 people staring at Harold, who stood frozen with the microphone in his trembling hands. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Then Thomas started clapping. Slow, deliberate applause that echoed across the garden. One by one, other guests joined in until the entire reception was applauding. Not polite wedding applause, but the kind of sustained ovation reserved for moments that change everything. Harold's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine. Shock, denial, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. He looked around desperately as if searching for someone to contradict my story, to restore his version of reality. That's not, he stammered into the microphone, then seemed to realize he was broadcasting his confusion to everyone. He fumbled to turn it off. Gerald Patterson stepped forward, his weathered face kind but firm. It's true, Harold. I've known about Linda's success for over a year. I've watched you accept her help while calling her worthless, and I've kept quiet because she asked me to. But watching you humiliate her publicly was more than I could stomach. Margaret finally found her voice. Linda, is this real? You've really been supporting Dad's business? I nodded. For 2 years. Every major contract he's landed has come through my company. I created a shell corporation specifically to hire him because I knew he'd never accept help directly from his worthless cripple daughter. The word hit differently now. Instead of making me smaller, it made Harold smaller. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd witnessed something truly ugly. Thomas's mother, an elegant woman in her 60s, approached my wheelchair. Linda, I'm Eleanor Whitman. I want to apologize for not speaking up earlier. What your father said was inexcusable, and what you've accomplished is extraordinary. Other guests began approaching, wanting to apologize, to compliment my courage to ask about my business. The reception's energy completely transformed. Instead of the awkward aftermath of family drama, it became a celebration of something unexpected and powerful. Harold stood alone near the microphone stand, watching his carefully constructed narrative crumble. For 20 years, he'd been the successful businessman with one perfect daughter and one disappointing burden. Now everyone knew the truth. He was a failing businessman whose life had been quietly saved by the daughter he'd publicly humiliated. Beverly finally approached me, tears streaming down her face. Linda, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped him years ago. I should have protected you. It's okay, Mom, I said, and meant it. I learned to protect myself. Margaret knelt beside my wheelchair, her wedding dress pooling around us on the grass. I can't believe you've been taking care of us all this time. While Dad was... God, Linda, I'm so ashamed. Don't be ashamed, I told her. This is your wedding day. You deserve to be happy. How can I be happy knowing what we've put you through, what I've put you through by staying silent? Thomas crouched down beside Margaret. Linda, I have to ask, why did you do it? Why help someone who treated you so terribly? I considered the question carefully. Because he's still my father. Because family is complicated. Because I had the power to help, and helping felt better than revenge. I paused. Until today, anyway. Harold finally gathered enough courage to approach us. His face was red with embarrassment and anger. You had no right to humiliate me like that. This is Margaret's wedding. You've ruined everything. The audacity of his statement left me speechless for a moment. I ruined everything, Harold. You called your daughter a worthless cripple in front of 100 people. I just told them the truth about who that daughter really is. You ambushed me. You set me up. I saved your business. For 2 years, I've been the reason you could sleep at night. The reason you didn't lose everything you've worked for. And you repaid me by publicly calling me worthless. Several guests were still listening to our conversation, and Harold seemed to realize he was making things worse for himself. We'll discuss this at home, he muttered. No, I said firmly. We'll discuss this now, or we'll never discuss it at all, because I'm done pretending that your shame is my responsibility. The reception continued around us, but our family drama had become the main event. Guests tried to give us privacy while clearly straining to overhear every word. Margaret had stopped crying and was watching our confrontation with fascination, like she was seeing both her father and sister clearly for the first time. Harold, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. For 20 years, you've made me feel like an embarrassment, like my disability was somehow my fault, like I was a burden you had to carry instead of a daughter you chose to love. He shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. I never meant. You absolutely meant it. Every dismissive comment. Every time you introduced me as Margaret's sister instead of my daughter. Every family gathering where you parked me in a corner like broken furniture. You meant all of it. Beverly stepped closer, her voice shaking with emotion. Harold, she's right. I've watched you treat Linda like she was less than human for 20 years, and I said nothing because I was afraid of your anger. But I can't watch it anymore. This was the first time in my adult life I'd heard my mother openly criticize my father. The change in family dynamics was seismic. Thomas, who'd been quietly observing our family's dysfunction, spoke up. Mr. Patterson, I have to ask. If Linda's been supporting your business for 2 years, doesn't that make her pretty much the opposite of worthless? Harold's face flushed deeper red. You don't understand the situation. The responsibility of having a disabled child. The limitations it puts on a family. What limitations? I asked. I graduated valedictorian. I have a successful business. I've been financially supporting this family. What exactly have I limited? Harold struggled for an answer. It's not about what you've accomplished. It's about what people think, how they see our family. And there it was. The truth Harold had been dancing around for 20 years. My disability embarrassed him, not because of anything I'd done or failed to do, but because of how it made him look to other people. So you'd rather have a failing business and maintain your pride than accept help from your disabled daughter, I said. And you'd rather publicly humiliate me than admit I'm successful. I didn't know it was you, he said weakly. If I'd known. You would have what refused the money, let your business fail rather than accept help from your worthless, crippled daughter. Gerald Patterson, who'd been quietly watching our exchange, stepped forward again. Harold, I think it's time you made a choice. You can keep doubling down on 20 years of cruelty, or you can acknowledge that you've been wrong about your daughter. Dead wrong. The crowd around us had grown larger. What started as family drama had become something more significant. A moment of reckoning that went beyond our personal dysfunction. Margaret suddenly stood up, her wedding dress rustling around her. Dad, stop. Just stop talking and listen to yourself. Linda has been nothing but generous to this family. She helped pay for my college when you were struggling. She's kept your business alive for 2 years. She's accomplished more than either of us ever imagined, and she did it all while you spent 20 years telling her she was worthless." Harold looked stung by Margaret's words. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was teaching you to be grateful for your abilities. By destroying your other daughter's self-worth," Margaret's voice was rising now, "by making Linda feel like she had to hide her success from her own family, Dad, that's not protection. That's cruelty." I watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Margaret was finally standing up for me, but it had taken a public confrontation to get here. 20 years too late, but better than never. "I don't expect you to change overnight," I told Harold. "I don't expect an apology or suddenly perfect family relationships, but I'm done accepting your version of who I am. I'm done making myself smaller to manage your discomfort with my disability." Harold looked around at the faces watching him. His wife, his daughters, his oldest friend, his new son-in-law, and dozens of wedding guests. All of them waiting to see if he could rise to this moment, or if he'd continue doubling down on decades of cruelty. "I never meant for things to go this far," he said finally. "I never meant to hurt you this badly." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from him. A tiny crack in 20 years of solid denial. The weeks following Margaret's wedding were unlike anything our family had ever experienced. The story of my confrontation with Harold spread through our small town like wildfire. Some people were horrified by his cruelty. Others were inspired by my success. Everyone had an opinion about our family drama. I received dozens of messages from people who'd witnessed the speech. Former classmates reached out to congratulate me on my business success. Local disability advocates asked me to speak at their events. 3 new corporate clients contacted me directly after hearing about my work. Harold, meanwhile, was experiencing the social consequences of his public cruelty. Several of his longtime customers quietly terminated their contracts. The local Rotary Club, where he'd been a member for 15 years, suggested he take a leave of absence to reflect on his family relationships. His reputation in the community, which he'd valued above everything else, was in shambles. 2 weeks after the wedding, he appeared at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't let him in, but curiosity won out. He sat awkwardly in my living room, looking around at the space I'd created for myself. My home office with 3 large monitors displaying active design projects. The expensive ergonomic wheelchair that insurance didn't cover, but my business income did. The adaptive kitchen equipment that made my life easier. All evidence of the independence and success he'd spent 20 years insisting I could never achieve. "I've been doing some thinking," he said without preamble. "About what you said at the wedding. About the business contracts. And I want to pay you back. For the money. For the contracts you sent my way." I studied his face, trying to determine if this was genuine accountability or just another attempt to restore his pride. "The money was a gift, Harold. You can't pay back a gift. It wasn't a gift if I didn't know it came from you. It was help. From your daughter, who you called worthless in front of 100 people." He winced at the reminder. I was wrong to say that. I was wrong about a lot of things. It wasn't the full apology I might have hoped for, but it was progress. More acknowledgement of wrongdoing than I'd received in 28 years. "What do you want from me?" I asked directly. "I want to understand how this happened. How you built all this." He gestured around my apartment. "How you became so successful while I was convinced you couldn't take care of yourself." So I told him. About the scholarship to Northwestern that he'd dismissed as charity. About the internships I'd worked while living in an inaccessible dorm room because I was determined to succeed. About the first client who paid me $500 for a logo design and how that felt like winning the lottery. About the gradual building of my reputation, my client base, my financial independence. Harold listened without interrupting, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't fully read. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes. "I convinced myself that being hard on you was helping you," he said finally. "That if I didn't push you to accept your limitations, you'd set yourself up for disappointment." "You mean you'd set yourself up for disappointment when I failed?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's closer to the truth." Margaret visited me a few days later, still processing everything that had happened at her wedding. "I keep thinking about all the times I should have stood up for you," she said. "All the times I heard Dad say something cruel and I just stayed quiet because it was easier." "You were protecting yourself," I told her. "I understand that. I was being a coward, and I was benefiting from his treatment of you. Every time he called you a burden, it made me feel more valuable by comparison." It was a painful admission, but an honest one. Margaret had built her identity partly on being the good daughter, which required me to be the disappointing one. "We can't change the past," I said, "but we can change how we move forward." Beverly's transformation was the most dramatic. For 20 years, she'd been the silent enabler, watching Harold's cruelty and saying nothing. But something shifted after the wedding. She started calling me regularly, asking about my work, my life, my feelings. She even attended a disability rights workshop to better understand my experiences. "I robbed you of a mother's protection," she told me during one of our conversations. "I was so afraid of Harold's anger that I forgot my first job was to defend my children." Gerald Patterson became an unexpected ally. He'd known about my success for over a year, but had respected my request for privacy. After the wedding, he helped me navigate the social aftermath and connected me with other business owners who admired my work. "Your father isn't a bad man," he told me one afternoon, "but he's a man who made a terrible mistake 20 years ago and then spent 2 decades making it worse instead of making it right." The most surprising change was in my relationship with myself. For 20 years, I'd carried Harold's shame like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I'd internalized his belief that my disability made me less valuable, less worthy of love and respect. Confronting him publicly hadn't just challenged his narrative about our family. It had finally freed me from accepting that narrative as truth. I started saying no to family obligations that felt performative. I stopped hiding my success or downplaying my accomplishments. I began dating for the first time in years, no longer convinced that no one could love someone in a wheelchair. I even started therapy to process 20 years of emotional abuse disguised as family dynamics. Not everything changed. Harold never offered the full apology I might have wanted. Our relationship remained complicated and somewhat distant. But I'd stopped waiting for his validation to feel valuable. I'd stopped needing his approval to know my worth. 6 months after Margaret's wedding, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I ended the anonymous contracts with Harold's business, not out of spite but out of self-respect. "I've been enabling your refusal to acknowledge my value," I told him during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. "By helping you secretly, I've allowed you to maintain the fiction that I'm not capable of contributing meaningfully to our family." He accepted this news with more grace than I'd expected. "I understand," he said, "and I want you to know that I'm grateful. For everything you did to save my business. For the patience you've shown while I figured out how wrong I've been." It still wasn't a complete apology, but it was acknowledgement. Progress. Harold's business struggled for a few months after losing my contracts, but he eventually found new clients. Smaller projects, more local work, but enough to keep the company afloat. He seemed relieved, actually, to be operating under his own merit, rather than unknowingly dependent on his daughter's charity. Margaret and I grew closer than we'd been since childhood. She made a conscious effort to include me in her life, to ask about my work, to treat me as a peer, rather than a burden to be managed. When she and Thomas bought their first house, I designed their landscaping plan. When they started talking about children, Margaret asked if I'd be the baby's godmother. "I want my children to know their Aunt Linda," she said. "Not the version of you that Dad created, but the real you, the successful, strong, amazing woman you've always been. Beverly continued her own journey of growth and accountability. She started volunteering with a local disability advocacy organization, learning about accessibility issues and the systemic barriers that disabled people face. "I can't undo 20 years of silence," she told me, "but I can make sure I spend the rest of my life speaking up." My business continued to grow. The publicity from the wedding confrontation surprisingly brought in several new clients who admired my courage and wanted to work with someone willing to stand up for themselves. I hired 2 part-time employees and moved into a larger office space designed specifically for accessibility. But the most important change was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by other people's expectations or limitations. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped making myself smaller to manage other people's discomfort with my disability. One evening, almost a year after the wedding, Harold called to tell me he'd been invited to speak at a local business conference about overcoming challenges in family-owned companies. "I'm going to tell them about you," he said, "about what you accomplished, about how wrong I was to underestimate you. Are you ready for people to know that your worthless, crippled daughter is actually more successful than you are?" I asked, not entirely without sarcasm. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm ready to tell people that my daughter Linda is the strongest, most accomplished person I know, and that I spent 20 years being too proud and too stupid to see it." It wasn't perfect. Our relationship would never be simple or uncomplicated. But it was honest. Finally, after 28 years, it was honest. As I hung up the phone that night, I realized something profound had shifted. I no longer needed Harold's approval to know my value. I no longer needed his acknowledgement to feel successful. I no longer needed his love to feel worthy of love. But having it finally felt pretty good anyway. I learned that sometimes you have to break open people's assumptions about you, even if it shatters their comfortable lies. I spent 20 years making myself smaller to manage my father's shame. But his shame was never mine to carry. Now I know that my worth isn't determined by anyone else's limitations, including my own family's. Sometimes the people who should love you unconditionally are the ones who need to earn the privilege of being in your life. The accident that paralyzed me when I was 8 years old changed everything about my life. But it was the choice to finally stand up for myself at 28 that truly set me free. Have you ever had to confront a family member who consistently underestimated you? How did you find the courage to speak your truth? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's limitations. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about who you really are. Until next time, keep believing in your own worth no matter who tries to convince you otherwise.